day to you. Hope you are doing fine. In today's lesson, we are going to discuss ecosystem. So after discussing ecosystem, you should be able to explain the terms mentioned in the topic ecosystem, name the types of habitats, the features of the ecosystem, the biological or the biotic and abiotic ecological factors and stuff. Okay, so let's jump into ecosystem. But before we start with ecosystem, let's define ecology, because ecology helps us to know the things in ecosystem. So ecology is the study of the interrelationships between living organisms and the environment in which they live in. I hope you had it. Ecology is the study of the interrelationships between living organisms. So the living organisms are plants and animals, and the environment in which they live in. Okay, so these are some of the terminologies in associated with ecology. So we'll be looking at the ecosystem, be looking at species, population, community, biome, ecological niche, biosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, then the habitat. Then later on, we go on to talk about the food chain and the food web. Okay, so let's explain the terms associated with ecology. Let's start with the first one, that's ecosystem. So ecosystem is a stable natural unit in which living organisms interact with the physical or the abiotic factors of the environment. I hope you had it. So it's still talking about the interaction. So the difference between the ecology and the ecosystem, the ecology is the study. You study the ecosystem or you study the interaction. Then the ecosystem talks about a stable natural unit in which the living organisms and their habitat, they interact. Are you getting it? All right. Okay. So let's move on to the second one. Species is a group of organisms that interbreed or mate. Interbreed or mate to produce fertile offspring. It's a group of organisms that interbreed or mate and produce fertile offspring. So if these organisms can produce fertile offspring, then which means they are not the same. Are you getting it? They don't belong to the same species. Are you getting it? Right. Okay, fine. Then the third one, population. In the ecosystem, we have a group of organisms living in the same area. That's what we term as population. So it's a group of organisms of the same species living in an area. Of the same species living in an area. A group of organisms of the same species living in an area. Then the next one, since we've seen a group or the total number of organisms of the same species living in an area, the different populations of the living organisms, that's the plants and animals, together in a particular area makes up a community. So a community is made up of the different population of living organisms, that's plants and animals, together living in a particular area at a particular time. That's what we term as what? Community. I hope you are getting the definitions right. The next one is the biome, B-I-O-M-E, biome. It's a large natural area of an ecosystem with a particular climate. So each ecosystem has its climate. So some can be rainy, some can be sunny, Yeah, so let's move on to the sixth one. That's the ecological niche. In an ecosystem, each organism occupies a certain space which is largely dependent upon its way of life. That's what we term as ecological niche. Then the next one is the biosphere or the ecosphere. And this is the part of the Earth's surface where life exists. It's a part of the Earth's surface where life exists. That's what you call the biosphere. And this biosphere is grouped into three. And the first one is the lithosphere, which is the part of the Earth's surface occupied by land. Then 2, we have the hydrosphere, which is the part of the Earth occupied by what? Water. So hydro, water. Then we have the atmosphere. So it's the part of the Earth's surface which is occupied by what? Air. So they are the three groups of the biosphere. Okay, so we can see that all the three supports life, whether on the land, in the water, or in the atmosphere. Okay, so the last terminology is what we term as the habitat. And this is an area where an organism lives successfully. It's an area or a place where an organism lives successfully. And we have types of habitat. We have the aquatic habitat and the terrestrial habitat. I hope you had it. Aquatic habitat and the terrestrial habitat. Okay, so let's explain the aquatic and the terrestrial. Let's take the first one, aquatic habitat. When we say aqua, what comes to your mind? Okay, water, right? So this habitat is talking about water. So a place, are you getting it? A place in an ecosystem made up of water. And this aquatic ecosystem or the water habitat can be grouped into two. That's the fresh water and the marine water. Fresh water and marine water. Let's look at the fresh water. Let's talk something about the fresh water. With the fresh water, it has low salt concentration. I'm repeating, it has low salt concentration. So examples like the ponds, the lake, the streams, rivers, etc. So the amount of salt in them is very, very low. And these are some of the organisms found in the fresh water. We have microscopic algae, such as the diatoms and the blue-green bacteria. And these microscopic algae, some are producers. Some are producers, which means they have the chlorophyll. They have the green pigment to undergo photosynthesis. And this type of microscopic producers are called the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton. So they are microscopic producers. Then in terms of the animals that do not undergo the photosynthesis, they are the zooplanktons. So they are the consumers. So as time goes on, I'll explain consumer producers to you. Okay, but let's note this. Let's move on to the marine. If fresh water contains low amount of salt, marine will be what? It contains higher amount of what? Salt, or the concentration of salt is very high in them. So example, like the sea, right? Okay, good. So they are the two types of habitats we know. So we've talked about, okay, so this is about aquatic habitats. Let's look at the terrestrial. When we say terrestrial, it means land. It means land. So we are talking about a place on the land where animals or living things can live successfully. So with the land, we have the rainforest and the savanna. The rainforest and savanna. That's for the land. I'm not going to talk much about the habitat. Let's look at the components of the ecosystem. Now, the ecosystem can be divided into two components. And these components are the biotic, that's the living component, then the abiotic, that's the non-living component. Okay, let's start with the biotic component. We said the biotic is the living component. So the biotic components include the living things, that's plants and animals, which can be grouped into the producers, consumers, and the decomposers. Let's explain the producers, consumers, decomposers. With the producers, they are mostly the green plants. They are the green plants. So they manufacture their own food through photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Then we have the consumers. The consumers can be either animals or plants, but they can't manufacture their own food, so they depend on the producers. So consumers can be categorized into the primary, secondary, and the tertiary. So stages. We have the primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Then the last one, that's the decomposers, and they are bacteria that feed. They are bacteria and fungi that feed on dead plants and animals. From them. So they are mostly bacteria and fungi. So when one dies, the bacteria and fungi in the soil feed on the dead body to break them down into organic matter. That's what we are talking about. Okay, then let's look at the abiotic components. Abiotic components, they are the non-living components in the ecosystem. So one, they can be the climatic factors, that's temperature, wind, humidity, sunlight, rainfall, and also salinity. Some can be dust. Some of the factors can be dust, storm, fire, water, the soil, the topography, rocks. Some can be inorganic materials such as carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen. Some can be nutrients like calcium, nitrogen, phosphorus, and what have you. So let's take them one by one. And let's note something. All the abiotic factors can be measured. So as we move on, I'll tell you the instruments used in measuring one factor of the abiotic component. I hope you are getting it. So let's look at the abiotic factors. So they are the physical factors which affect living things and their environment. They affect them both positively and negatively. So let's take the first one. We made mention of temperature. What is the instrument used for measuring temperature? Right, that's thermometer. So let's look at the positive side and the negative side. Increase in temperature or high temperatures speed up the growth of some organisms. And also, increase in temperature also increases the rate of evaporation. And that will be the what? Disadvantage. So the soil or the tree, both of them will lose water, which won't support plant growth. So we've discussed two, one positive side, one negative side. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Rainfall. How does it affect living organisms? Germination of seed is also affected by rain. So they need to absorb water for them to sprout or to sprout out in the soil or to germinate. Yeah. Then also it also serves as a habitat for some organisms. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Humidity. So humidity is the measure is the amount of water vapor or moisture in the atmosphere. It's the amount of water vapor or moisture in the atmosphere. The next one is wind. Wind is air in motion. The definition for wind is air in motion. So the difference between wind and air is a mixture of gases and wind is air in motion. Okay, now relative humidity. The instrument to measure relative humidity is the hygrometer. Okay, so let's move on to wind. Now, wind can be grouped into two. You have the wind speed and the wind direction. The wind speed is measured by an instrument called an anemometer. Wind speed is measured by an instrument called an anemometer. And the direction of the wind is measured by an instrument called the vane or wind vane. I made mention of salinity as part of the factors. Salinity talks about the concentration of salt, the amount of salt concentration. Yes, okay. The amount of salt concentration in water, or how salt is dissolved in water. Okay, so everyone, how to grab it, fine, it's yours. Yes, and also another factor is called the pH concentration, and that's in soil. pH concentration. This determines whether the soil is acidic or basic, or what we term as the alkalinity. Yes, okay. So it's also a factor. Then we have light intensity. Light intensity, we are talking about sunlight, and it's measured with an instrument called the photometer or the light meter. Photometer or the light meter. Let's look at some useful biotic factors in the forest habitat. One, termites aiding decomposition and aeration of the soil. When we say aeration, it means the pores in the soil that allows the penetration of air. So these termites create or they burrow holes in the soil, which gives it a space for air to pass through. That's what we call the aeration. Okay, then nitrogen fixing bacteria also improves soil fertility. They add nitrogen to the soil. That aids in its fertility. Okay, so I'll talk about only two. We have more to discuss. Now, since we've looked at both the living and the non-living components in the ecosystem, now let's look at how the living components, that's the plant and animal, they interact, or how one feeds on the other and how energy is transferred from one to the other. Okay, so this brings us to the subtopic food chain. Food chain. So what is a food chain? Food chain is a linear feeding relationship or the direct sequences of energy flow among organisms in an ecosystem. So it's the linear feeding relationship that shows the energy flow from one organism to the other in an ecosystem. Now, with the food chain, this is how the pattern goes. It starts from the producer. It always starts from the producer because they produce the food. And I said the producers are the green plants. So they manufacture their own food. It always starts with the producers. Then moves on to the consumers. So with the consumers, you can break them down to primary, secondary, tertiary. Then the last one will be for the decomposers. But it depends. If the question doesn't have a decomposer, it will end on the tertiary consumer or the secondary consumer. We form the food chain. So example, let me give you these examples for you to construct a food chain for me. Let me see. Okay, let's say I have grass, sheep, man, tapeworm. Grass, man, tapeworm, sheep. Now let's start with the construction. We said we always start from the what? The producers. So from the question, which one is the producer? The green plant. That's grass, right? Grass. Now, after the grass, we need an animal to feed on the grass. So a herbivore. So that will be sheep, right? Herbivore, sheep. Okay. After the sheep feeds on the grass, another animal or another organism should feed on the sheep. So here I gave you tapeworm and man. Which one will feed on the sheep? That's man, right? Good. So the next one is man. Then the last one is what? Tapeworm. We know tapeworm is in our stomach. They lie in the intestinal walls of our stomach. So tapeworm, they will take the last nutrient. So this is how we construct the food chain. But the energy flow in the food chain is not always 100%. Let's go to the next one. We said food chain is a linear feeding relationship. Let's look at food web. Food web is a complex feeding relationship by which an organism can be fed with more than one food. So we can say that is the network of many food chains. The network of many food chains. That's why it's considered as what? Complex. So you join many food chains together to get a food web. Okay, so that's it. Okay, so since we've seen this, now let's look at the biological associations. How organisms benefit or they interact to benefit from one another, or even though they don't benefit, they get some kind of protection. That's what we call the biological associations. Okay, the first one is predation. Predation. This involves the predator and the prey. So it's the relationship between two groups of animals in which one species hunts, kills, and eats the other. So let's give an example: the lion and the antelope. The lion becomes the predator, and the antelope becomes the prey. So we are saying that these two groups of animals, one of them hunts and kills and eats, and that's the lion. So that's what we call predation. The next one is competition. This is whereby organisms struggle for resources such as food, light, water, nutrients, gases, and space. That's what we term as competition. And this occurs both in plants and animals. Okay. Now, some organisms form close relationships with other organisms. It can be within the same species or different species. Within organisms of the same species is what we term as the intraspecific. Then, of different species is what we term as the interspecific. I hope you had it. Intraspecific between organisms of the same species, then interspecific between organisms of different species. Commensalism and parasitism. Let's start with the first one. Mutualism. Mutualism is a close relationship between two organisms of different species in which both partners benefit. So both of them will benefit. So example of this relationship, the nitrogen fixing bacteria, that's the rhizobium, which lives in the root nodules of leguminous plants. So these bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates, which are readily absorbed by the roots of the plant. and the bacterium gains protection and food from the relationship, while the plant is able to thrive in the nitrate-poor soils. That's one of them. That is commensalism. With commensalism, the relationship between two living organisms of different species, which is beneficial to one but does not affect the other. So with commensalism, these two organisms, one benefits from the other but doesn't affect the other. Example is a small fish called the remora, which lives on a shark attached by its sucker. So when the shark feeds, the remora detached itself and feeds on the scraps of the food discarded by the shark. But the shark doesn't harm the small fish. So the fish is on the shark. After the shark has fed on scraps of food, then this fish feeds on this food. But the shark doesn't eat or feed on the fish. That's what we term as the commensalism. So one will benefit but doesn't affect the other. Then the last but two, is called the parasitism. And this is a close relationship between two organisms in which the parasite lives in or on the body of the host, deriving benefit from it and causing harm to it. So, example, human being and tapeworm. Tapeworms lies in the intestinal walls in our stomach. So when we eat, they derive the benefits because they lie. So any benefit that can be absorbed it. So someone with tapeworm who doesn't deworm, you can see the person always eats but doesn't grow. Just by the way, the tapeworm are taking all the nutrients. So that's parasitism. Then the last one is saprophytism. So the living organism produces and secretes digestive enzymes from thread-like hyphae which grow through dead organic matter. So this type of feeding, the organisms feed on dead organic matter. And this kind of digestion is found outside the body and it's called the extracellular digestion. Then the last one for today is what we call the epiphytism. This is whereby an epiphyte grows on another plant. What's an epiphyte? An epiphyte is a plant that grows on another plant and is supported by that plant. But it does not take any food from the plant or the tree. That's the host. Epiphytes are also called the aerophytes or the air plants. Where can we find the epiphytes? An example is the palm tree. On the palm tree, you see this tiny plants that grow. They have green leaves. They are tiny plant that grows on the palm tree. Used in studying ecology. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. So let's look at them one by one. We have the wicker work trap. It's used for collecting larger animals. The pH meter used for determining the pH of substances. We have the plankton net for collecting small animals or organisms on the surface of the water. Then we have the long handle net. It's used for also collecting surface animals and floating plants. We have the butterfly net. It's used for catching insects. We have the sweep net. It's also used for collecting insects and some land vertebrates. We have the poulter, used for collecting small animal specimens found on vegetation and cracks. We have the wind vane, used for measuring wind direction, photometer for measuring light intensity, anemometer for measuring wind speed, hygrometer for measuring relative humidity, then thermometer for measuring temperature, then the rain gauge for measuring the amount of rainfall. Okay, so this brings us to the end of today's lesson. What have we learned so far? At the beginning of the lesson, we learned that ecology is the study of interrelationships between living organisms and the environment in which they live in. We looked at the terminologies, the types of habitats, the aquatic and the terrestrial. We said aquatic means water, terrestrial means land. We said the energy flow is not 100%. We also looked at the food web. It's a complex feeding relationship, or is a network of many food chains. Okay, so we looked at them. Then we also looked at the biological associations. We looked at competition, the organisms struggling for food, gases, light, space. Then we also looked at the symbiosis, which is the close relationship between organisms. It can be interspecific or intraspecific, between the same species or different species. We looked at mutualism, whereby organisms benefit from each other. We looked at commensalism, whereby one organism benefits from the other but does not affect it. We looked at parasitism, is whereby the one organism, that's the parasite, depends on the host, that's deriving benefits from it and causing harm to it. We look at saprophytism, organisms feeding on dead organic matter. We looked at the last one, that's the epiphytism, a plant growing on another plant, so that plant supports it. Okay, so this brings us to the end of today's lesson.